You notice it before you can explain it. The things that once pulled at you no longer do, not because something new replaced them, but because the pull itself softened. The urgency faded. What used to feel necessary now feels distant, almost neutral. This recognition arrives quietly, without drama, as if it has always been here and you are only now detecting it. There is no loss in this moment, no sacrifice, just a subtle absence of pressure. The system inside you has stopped reaching for familiar signals. Desires that once organized your days now pass through awareness without hooking into it. You are not suppressing them. You are not resisting. They simply do not generate the same response. The observer notices the change without commentary. This is not confusion. It is not emptiness. It is coherence beginning to stabilize. When a pattern updates, it does not announce itself. It removes noise. The quantum field does not demand that you understand what is happening. It only adjusts what resonates. And you feel that adjustment as a lowering of intensity, a gentle stillness where friction used to be. You might have expected excitement when this happened, or clarity in the form of answers. Instead, there is quiet, a sense that something completed itself without your involvement. The mind searches for a reason, but the system does not provide one. It does not need to. Recognition is enough. What you are sensing is not detachment in the way you once defined it. It is not numbness. It is the absence of unnecessary effort. The internal signal that kept looping has weakened, and without that loop, the body settles, breathing slows, attention widens. The timeline feels less urgent, less demanding. This moment did not arrive because you tried to reach it. It arrived because the conditions aligned. The pattern that sustained old desires reached its threshold and dissolved naturally. Nothing was taken from you. Nothing was added. The system simply stopped requesting the same outputs. There is relief here, even if you do not label it as such. A subtle permission to rest inside your own awareness. The observer no longer needs to chase confirmation. The field no longer pushes stimuli to keep you engaged. You are allowed to remain where you are, without interpretation. This recognition does not require action. It does not require decision. It only asks that you notice the calm where urgency used to live. The absence of pull is not a void. It is space. And space is how coherence makes itself known. You are not becoming someone else. You are not losing anything essential. You are witnessing a system that has recalibrated itself. The old signals did their work. They carried you to this point. And now, without announcement, they have gone quiet. Stay with the stillness of that knowing. Let it register without meaning-making. The pattern has updated, and the system is stabilizing. Nothing more is required from you in this moment. What follows that initial quiet is not an answer, but a shift in how absence feels. You begin to notice that you are not reaching for replacements. When an old desire releases its grip, the system does not rush to fill the space. There is no immediate substitute, no new fixation to stabilize identity. Instead, there is a pause that stretches longer than expected. The mind watches this pause carefully, waiting for something to happen, but nothing arrives, and slowly, that waiting dissolves. This is unfamiliar because the system you lived in before relied on momentum. Wanting created direction. Direction created a sense of self. Without that sequence, there can be a brief disorientation, not panic, but a mild uncertainty. You may sense it as a floating quality, as if your attention is no longer anchored to predictable markers. Yet beneath that sensation, there is steadiness. A deeper layer remains untouched by the loss of reference points. The observer inside you starts to recognize this difference. Before, awareness was organized around pursuit. Now it organizes itself around presence. You are still engaged with the world, but not entangled in it. Stimuli appear, register, and pass through without demanding follow-up. This is not withdrawal. It is efficiency. The system has learned what no longer needs reinforcement. You might notice moments where you instinctively check for interest, as if to confirm that it truly isn't there anymore. An old thought arises, something that once triggered excitement or concern, and you wait for the familiar response. It does not come. The body remains neutral. The mind pauses, almost surprised. Then, it moves on. This is how detection works when a pattern has completed. The absence of reaction is the signal. There is a temptation to interpret this as a loss of motivation, but that interpretation does not hold. Motivation was always a response to lack. It existed to close a perceived gap. As coherence increases, gaps close on their own. The system no longer needs to generate drive to compensate for misalignment. What remains is not apathy, but alignment without effort. You may find yourself doing things simply because they are there to be done, without narrative. Actions happen, but they are not charged with identity or expectation. Success and failure lose their emotional weight. They become data points rather than verdicts. The timeline loosens its grip. Past and future stop pulling attention away from the present moment. This is often the point where the mind tries to reclaim control. It looks for meaning, for a story to explain why this shift occurred. It might search memory for a cause, or project forward to imagine consequences. But the field does not respond to that search. It remains quiet, steady, uninterested in justification. The more you allow that silence, the more the system stabilizes around it. You are not being emptied, you are being simplified. Layers of response that once felt essential are no longer required. The nervous system senses this reduction and begins to settle into a lower baseline. There is less internal negotiation, fewer micro-decisions, less background tension. You may notice this as deeper rest, even while awake. A sense that you are supported by something that does not need your input. At times, this can feel almost invisible. Nothing dramatic marks the transition. There is no clear boundary between before and after. The shift expresses itself through subtle changes in attention, through the way silence feels less uncomfortable, through the absence of urgency where urgency once lived. These are not signs to be analyzed. They are confirmations that the system is operating differently now. As this continues, seeking becomes less attractive. Questions still arise, but they do not demand answers. Curiosity softens into observation. You are no longer scanning the environment for cues about who you should be or what you should want. Recognition replaces effort. You sense that whatever needs to be known will surface on its own, without pursuit. This is how coherence deepens. Not through accumulation, but through subtraction. Not through intensity, but through stillness. The pattern did not update to give you something new to chase. It updated to remove what no longer needed to be chased at all. And in that removal, a quieter form of clarity begins to take shape, one that does not require your participation to remain intact. As the system settles into this quieter mode, another subtle perception begins to surface. You start to sense how much energy was once devoted to maintaining alignment with desires that were already fading. Not in a dramatic way, not as regret, but as a gentle realization. The body remembers the effort, even when the mind no longer identifies with it. And as that effort releases, there is a soft recalibration that moves through you. This recalibration does not feel like improvement. It feels like normalization. Muscles loosen without instruction. Breathing becomes more even. Attention stops darting ahead of itself. The observer notices that there is less internal commentary attached to experience. Moments pass without being evaluated. You are present with what is happening, but you are not managing it. At times, this can create a strange sense of transparency. You feel more permeable, as if the boundary between inner and outer has thinned. Sounds register more clearly. Light feels less harsh. Conversations unfold without the need to anticipate outcomes. You listen without preparing a response. You speak without rehearsing. The system trusts itself to respond appropriately without oversight. There may also be moments when you notice how little you need to reference the past. Memories still exist, but they do not intrude. They no longer assert relevance. When they appear, they feel complete, as if their role has already been fulfilled. The timeline reorganizes itself around the present, not by force, but by relevance. What matters now is simply what is here. This can feel disorienting if you were accustomed to using memory as a stabilizing structure. Without it, identity feels lighter, not diminished, just less dense. You are not constantly reinforcing a narrative about who you are or where you are going. The system does not require that narrative to function. It operates on direct perception instead. You might notice that decisions arise differently. Instead of weighing options against long-term desires or imagined futures, choices present themselves as obvious. There is less deliberation, fewer internal arguments. Action happens when it is appropriate, and pauses happen when nothing is required. The absence of desire does not create stagnation, it creates accuracy. At first, this accuracy can be mistaken for passivity, but passivity implies disengagement. What you are experiencing is engagement without tension. You are involved, but not invested in outcomes. The quantum field does not need you to attach significance to every movement. It only requires coherence, and coherence emerges naturally when resistance dissolves. There may be moments when old patterns attempt to reassert themselves. A familiar urge surfaces, testing whether the system will respond as it once did. You notice the impulse without judgment. It moves through awareness and finds no traction. The body remains calm. The mind does not amplify it. This is not suppression. It is recognition that the signal no longer matches the field. As this continues, you begin to trust the absence of desire as information. It tells you where alignment already exists. Where nothing pulls, nothing is missing. This understanding does not arrive as a thought. It arrives as ease, a sense that you are exactly where you need to be, not because something special has happened, but because nothing is demanding correction. You may also notice a reduction in comparison. Other timelines, other paths, other versions of yourself lose their emotional charge. You are no longer measuring your position against imagined alternatives. The observer recognizes that comparison was a byproduct of seeking. Without seeking, there is nothing to compare. Each moment stands on its own. This can feel like a kind of internal quiet that extends outward. Interactions become simpler. You are less reactive to other people's urgency or confusion. Their patterns register, but they do not entangle with yours. You remain present without absorbing what does not belong to you. The system maintains its coherence without effort. What you are experiencing here is not an endpoint. It is a stabilization phase. The pattern update did not occur to create a new identity or role. It occurred to reduce internal noise so that perception can operate without distortion. The field does not rush this process. It allows it to deepen at its own pace. As this deepening continues, you may notice that even the desire to understand what is happening begins to soften. Curiosity remains, but it is no longer urgent. You are content to let recognition unfold without forcing clarity. The system feels reliable now. It does not need constant monitoring. Stay with this sense of accuracy. Let it inform how you move, how you rest, how you notice. There is nothing to achieve from here. There is only the ongoing refinement of coherence, happening quietly beneath awareness, adjusting signals so subtly that the observer can finally relax into simply being present. As coherence stabilizes further, you begin to notice a change in how effort registers inside you. Not physical effort, but the subtle inner pushing that once accompanied almost everything. It becomes clear that much of what you called engagement was actually tension disguised as intention. Now, without that tension, movement feels different, quieter, more exact. You may sense this when you begin a task and realize there is no internal resistance to starting and no urgency to finish. The action unfolds at its own pace. Time no longer compresses or stretches around expectation. It simply passes. The system no longer uses pressure as a motivator. It does not need to. Alignment has replaced force. This shift can feel unsettling at first because tension once served as a reference point. It told you something mattered. Without it, significance feels redistributed, not absent, but less dramatic. You may notice that you no longer elevate certain moments over others. There is less hierarchy in experience. Each moment arrives with roughly the same weight, the same openness. The observer detects this flattening not as boredom, but as balance. Emotional spikes smooth out, highs soften, lows lose depth. You are not dulled, you are regulated. The nervous system recognizes that it no longer needs to stay alert for correction. The environment feels less adversarial, even when it is complex. You may also notice that language itself begins to slow internally. Thoughts become fewer but more precise. There is less mental rehearsal, less commentary layered over direct perception. When a thought does appear, it tends to be functional rather than interpretive. It serves the moment, then dissolves. Silence becomes the default again. This silence is not empty, it is responsive. From it, clarity emerges when needed, without anticipation. You do not have to search for the right response. It arrives, already formed. This can feel almost impersonal, as if the system itself is responding rather than a constructed identity. And in a sense, that is accurate. Identity loosens its grip here, not through loss, but through irrelevance. You still know who you are, but you no longer need to assert it internally. The pattern that once reinforced self-definition has quieted. You are no longer maintaining a position in the world. You are simply occupying space within it. There can be moments when this feels like invisibility, not to others but to yourself. The internal spotlight that once illuminated every reaction dims. You notice less about yourself and more about what is actually happening. This shift in attention reduces self-consciousness without effort. You are present without self-reference. This presence alters how you relate to uncertainty. Questions about direction or purpose may arise, but they do not create tension. They float through awareness without demanding resolution. The system understands that resolution is not required for stability. It trusts the field to organize events without your supervision. At times, you may notice a gentle detachment from outcomes that once carried emotional weight. Results still matter in a practical sense, but they do not imprint on your sense of coherence. Success does not inflate. Failure does not diminish. Both register as feedback, not as identity markers. The observer remains steady. This steadiness is not cultivated. It is the byproduct of reduced interference. When fewer signals compete for attention, the system naturally aligns. You may begin to sense that much of what you once tried to manage never required management at all. It only required space to resolve itself. There may also be a growing comfort with pauses. Moments where nothing is happening no longer feel like gaps to be filled. They feel complete in themselves. You are able to sit in stillness without scanning for the next input. This is not withdrawal from life. It is synchronization with it. As this continues, you might notice that even subtle forms of self-improvement lose urgency. The drive to refine, optimize, or correct softens, not because growth has stopped, but because it no longer needs to be directed. The system adjusts continuously, beneath awareness, without instruction. You are not standing still. You are moving with less friction. The pattern update did not remove motion, it removed resistance. What remains is a quieter, more precise engagement with reality, one that does not announce itself or seek validation. Let this be as it is. There is no need to hold on to the experience or to name it. Recognition has already occurred. The observer has registered the change. The system is operating from a different baseline now, one where effort is no longer mistaken for importance, and stillness is no longer mistaken for absence. As this baseline becomes familiar, you begin to notice how differently the world meets you. Not because the world has changed, but because the filter you once applied has thinned. Interactions arrive with less distortion. You hear what is said without immediately translating it into implication. You see behavior without assigning motive. The system processes input cleanly without layering it with assumption. This clarity can feel almost neutral at first. Situations that once triggered immediate internal movement now register as information. You notice a comment, a delay, a shift in tone, and nothing inside you tightens. There is space between perception and response. In that space, the observer remains steady, unconcerned with defending or advancing a position. You may realize that much of your previous engagement with the world was shaped by anticipation. You were constantly adjusting to what you thought might happen next. Now, anticipation loosens. You meet events as they occur, not as projections. This changes the texture of experience. Moments feel more complete, less fragmented by expectation. There can be a subtle grief here, though it does not announce itself as such. A recognition of how much energy was once invested in managing outcomes, maintaining alignment with imagined futures. This recognition does not come with regret. It arrives as understanding. The system acknowledges its own evolution without judgment. You might notice that planning feels different now. You still organize, still prepare, but without emotional charge. Plans exist as structures, not as anchors for security. If they change, the system adapts without destabilizing. The timeline no longer feels rigid. It feels responsive, capable of adjusting without collapse. This responsiveness extends inward as well. Emotional states move through you with less resistance. Sadness, when it appears, does not deepen into narrative. Joy does not demand preservation. Each state is allowed to complete its cycle without interference. The observer witnesses the movement without becoming entangled in it. You may also notice a change in how you relate to control. The impulse to manage details softens, not because you have given up responsibility, but because you sense that over-control was never effective. The system recognizes where intervention is useful and where it is unnecessary. This discernment does not require thought. It is felt as ease. There can be moments when this ease feels almost too quiet, as if something is missing. The mind may scan for stimulation, for intensity, for confirmation that you are engaged. But the absence of intensity is not disengagement. It is regulation. The system has learned to operate without constant activation. In conversations, you may find yourself listening more fully, not waiting for your turn, not shaping your response while the other speaks. You hear words as they are, without preparing counterpoints or validations. This presence alters the exchange. Others may feel it, even if they cannot name it. The field responds to coherence. You may also notice a reduction in self-monitoring. You are less concerned with how you appear, how you are perceived. Not because you are indifferent, but because perception no longer defines you. The internal reference point has shifted inward, away from external feedback loops. This shift can create a sense of autonomy that is quiet rather than assertive. You do not need to assert boundaries aggressively. They exist naturally. When something does not resonate, it simply does not engage. There is no conflict required. The pattern update has refined your detection. At times, you may catch yourself waiting for a familiar surge of desire to return just to confirm that it is truly gone. But what you find instead is a different form of interest. Not craving, but curiosity. Not attachment, but openness. You are interested in what is happening, not in owning or directing it. This openness allows you to move through environments without absorbing their urgency. Crowds, noise, conflicting agendas register without overwhelming. The system maintains its coherence amidst variability. You are no longer calibrating yourself against every external signal. There may be a growing trust here, not in outcomes, but in process. You sense that whatever needs to unfold will do so without force. This trust is not blind, it is experiential. You have already felt the system update itself without your intervention. That recognition changes how you relate to uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer signals danger, it signals space. Space for patterns to reorganize beyond your current understanding. You do not need to rush this reorganization. You are not late. Nothing is slipping away. The absence of urgency is itself information. As this understanding settles, you may notice that even the idea of progress feels different. Progress is no longer measured by accumulation or achievement. It is sensed as alignment. When things feel aligned, there is nothing to improve. When they are not, adjustment happens naturally, without force. You are learning, quietly, how to remain present without effort, how to engage without tension, how to allow the system to operate without constant oversight. This learning does not require affirmation. It is self-validating, felt in the body as steadiness, in the mind as clarity, in awareness as ease. Remain with this mode of perception. There is no need to define it or hold on to it. It is not a state to maintain. It is the system's current configuration, responsive and alive, adjusting moment by moment without announcing its movements. As this configuration settles more deeply, you begin to notice how the absence of old desires reshapes your sense of direction, not by removing it, but by changing where it originates. Direction no longer comes from wanting something to be different. It arises from a quiet recognition of what fits and what does not. Movement begins from alignment rather than lack. You may notice that when you are about to step into something misaligned, the system registers it immediately, not as anxiety, not as resistance, but as a gentle dullness. Energy does not gather around the idea. The body remains neutral, uninterested. This neutrality is not indecision. It is accurate detection. The signal simply does not amplify. In contrast, when something is coherent, there is no surge of excitement. There is a calm readiness, a sense of yes that does not need justification. The observer recognizes this difference not through emotion, but through ease. Actions that align do not require convincing. They unfold with minimal friction. This can be disorienting if you were accustomed to using desire as a compass. Desire was loud. It demanded attention. It created momentum through intensity. Now, direction is quiet. It does not insist. It waits to be noticed. You learn to listen differently, to sense what resonates, without expecting a rush. There may be moments when the mind tries to recreate the old structure. It may generate artificial urgency, invent reasons why something should matter more than it does. You notice this attempt without judgment. The system does not respond to the manufactured signal. It remains steady, uninterested in urgency that does not originate from coherence. This steadiness changes how you experience time. Deadlines feel less oppressive. Waiting feels less empty. You are no longer filling time with anticipation or regret. Each moment stands on its own, complete enough to be experienced without reference to what came before or what might come after. You may also notice a reduction in internal conflict. Decisions no longer fracture you into competing parts. There is less debate, less weighing of pros and cons. Not because choices have become simpler, but because alignment reduces complexity. When something fits, it fits. When it does not, the system does not push. This reduction in conflict frees attention. You are no longer split between competing impulses. Awareness becomes more unified. The observer does not need to mediate between desires pulling in opposite directions. There is a singularity of movement that feels calm and continuous. In this state, creativity may express itself differently, not as bursts of inspiration, but as steady output. Ideas arrive without drama. Solutions appear without struggle. You are not trying to be creative. You are simply responding to what is present. The field supplies what is needed when interference is low. There can also be a shift in how you relate to effort. You may notice that you stop pushing yourself to maintain momentum. Rest and action begin to alternate naturally. When energy is available, it moves. When it is not, stillness takes over without guilt. The system regulates itself without moral overlay. This self-regulation extends to attention. You are less prone to distraction, not because you are forcing focus, but because there is less internal noise competing for awareness. Attention settles where it is useful, then releases. You are not holding it in place. It rests where it belongs. At times, you may sense a quiet confidence emerging. Not confidence in outcomes or abilities, but confidence in perception. You trust what you sense more than what you think. The observer has learned that perception, when undistorted, is reliable. This trust reduces the need for external validation. You may also notice a subtle shift in how you relate to endings. When something completes, there is less clinging. Completion feels natural, not abrupt. The system recognizes when a pattern has fulfilled its function and releases it without mourning. There is appreciation, but no attachment. This capacity to release without loss is one of the quieter effects of coherence. You are not detaching from life. You are detaching from unnecessary continuation. The field does not require patterns to persist beyond their usefulness. Neither do you. As this understanding integrates, you may notice that even silence feels informative. Pauses carry meaning. Gaps are not empty. They are spaces where the system recalibrates. You do not rush to fill them. You allow them to do their work. The observer remains present through all of this, not as a controller, but as a witness. You are aware of the shifts without trying to guide them. This awareness is enough. The system responds to recognition more than to effort. You are learning, in a quiet way, how to move without wanting movement, how to choose without craving choice, how to be present without trying to be present. This learning does not conclude, it deepens. It refines itself moment by moment, guided by coherence rather than desire, by alignment rather than urgency. As this refinement continues, you begin to notice how silence itself starts to guide you, not as an instruction, not as a voice, but as a reference point. When something aligns, silence remains intact. When something does not, silence is disturbed. This distinction becomes clearer over time, not because you analyze it, but because the system responds consistently. You may notice that when you agree to something misaligned, there is a faint internal noise, not loud enough to demand attention, but present enough to register. A subtle tightening, a slight restlessness. The observer detects this immediately now. There is no confusion about what it means. The signal is clear, even if the reason is not. In contrast, when you move in a direction that fits, there is no internal commentary. Silence deepens rather than breaks. This depth feels supportive, not empty. It holds the action rather than questioning it. You begin to trust this feedback because it repeats itself without contradiction. This trust reshapes how you evaluate experiences. You no longer rely on external markers to determine whether something was right or wrong. Feedback still exists, but it is secondary. Primary information comes from within the system, from how coherence responds after the fact. You feel whether something integrated cleanly or left residue. Residue becomes easier to notice now, not as guilt or regret, but as lingering tension. When something is incomplete or misaligned, it does not resolve fully. It leaves a trace. The observer registers this trace without judgment. It does not demand correction, only awareness. Often, awareness alone allows the trace to dissolve. This sensitivity can make you more selective, though not in an active way. You are not filtering life aggressively, you are simply less available for what disrupts coherence. Invitations that once felt compelling now feel neutral. Obligations that relied on pressure lose their hold. You are not withdrawing, you are responding accurately. There may be moments when this accuracy feels like distance from others. Not emotional distance, but vibrational difference. You notice urgency in others that you no longer share. Their timelines move faster, louder. Yours moves steadily, without acceleration. This difference does not create superiority or separation, it creates clarity. You may find that you no longer feel the need to explain yourself. Explanations were often attempts to bridge misalignment. Now, when alignment is present, explanation feels unnecessary. When it is absent, explanation would not help. The system chooses simplicity over justification. This simplicity extends to how you handle mistakes. When something does not work as expected, there is no internal collapse. You notice the outcome, register the information, and adjust. There is no self-reproach, no narrative about failure. The observer treats the event as data, not as evidence. This approach reduces emotional lag. Experiences resolve more quickly. You do not carry them forward unnecessarily. Each moment completes itself, leaving space for the next. The timeline becomes less congested with unfinished reactions. As this continues, you may notice a subtle increase in patience. Not patience as endurance, but patience as lack of urgency. You are willing to let things unfold at their own pace because you are no longer waiting for them to validate you. Validation comes from coherence, not from results. This can change how you experience growth. Growth no longer feels like expansion. It feels like refinement, like excess being trimmed away until what remains fits cleanly. There is less to manage, less to protect. The system becomes more resilient as it becomes simpler. You may also notice that your relationship with uncertainty continues to soften. Unknowns no longer trigger planning reflexes. They are allowed to remain unknown. This does not create passivity. It creates openness. You are receptive without being expectant. In this openness, intuition expresses itself differently. It is not a sudden insight or a strong feeling. It is a quiet knowing that does not require confirmation. You act on it without making it special. The observer recognizes intuition as another form of accurate perception, not as something mystical or rare. This normalization of intuition reduces internal hierarchy. Thoughts, feelings, sensations, and perceptions all carry information. None dominate. The system integrates them fluidly. You respond to the whole rather than to isolated signals. There may be moments when you realize how little you are thinking about yourself, not because you are avoiding self-reflection, but because self-reference has lost priority. Attention rests on what is happening rather than on who it is happening to. This shift reduces self-consciousness without effort. In this mode, presence feels stable. You are not trying to stay present, you simply are. When attention drifts, it returns naturally. There is no struggle. The observer does not need to enforce awareness. Awareness sustains itself. As this becomes familiar, you may sense a quiet gratitude arising, not directed at anything in particular, not expressed as emotion. It is more like acknowledgement, a recognition that the system is functioning efficiently without excess strain. This acknowledgement does not demand expression, it settles into stillness. From that stillness, responsiveness remains intact. You are available to what is real without being pulled by what is no longer relevant. The pattern continues to refine itself, not toward a destination, but toward greater accuracy. Each moment provides feedback. Each response adjusts the system slightly. You do not need to track this process. It unfolds on its own, guided by coherence rather than desire, by silence rather than urgency. At this stage, you may begin to sense how little effort it now takes to remain aligned. What once required constant adjustment now holds itself. The system has learned its own equilibrium. You are no longer correcting course moment by moment. You are allowing the field to inform movement without interference. This does not mean that challenges disappear. They still arise. Complexity still exists, but your relationship to challenge has changed. You meet it without contraction. The body stays open. The mind does not escalate. You address what is in front of you without adding layers of meaning that do not belong. You may notice that when something unexpected occurs, there is a brief pause instead of an immediate reaction. In that pause, perception sharpens. You see more of what is actually happening. The observer remains neutral, curious, rather than defensive. From this neutrality, response emerges cleanly. This clean response can feel almost automatic, not because you are disengaged, but because you are no longer debating internally. The system does not need to consult competing narratives. It draws from coherence and moves. Action feels proportionate to the situation, neither excessive nor withheld. There can be moments when you realize that you are no longer preparing yourself for future scenarios. The mental rehearsals that once occupied so much space have faded. You trust that when something arrives, you will meet it adequately. This trust is not an idea, it is embodied. It lives in the absence of preparation. This absence frees attention. You are more available to what is happening now. Subtle details register more clearly. You notice shifts in tone, changes in atmosphere, small signals that you once overlooked. The field feels more communicative, not because it is sending more information, but because you are receiving without distortion. You may also notice that your energy recovers more quickly. When something is demanding, you engage fully. When it passes, you release. There is less residue. Fatigue resolves faster. Rest feels deeper. The system does not carry unnecessary tension forward. This efficiency extends to emotion as well. Feelings arise and complete themselves. You do not prolong them through rumination. You do not suppress them either. They move through awareness, inform perception, and then dissolve. Emotional weather no longer defines the climate. At times, this can create a sense of lightness that is difficult to describe. Not elation, not happiness, but reduced density. You feel less burdened by your own processes. There is more space inside experience. This space allows for flexibility, for adaptation without strain. You may notice that your tolerance for noise, both internal and external, has decreased. Not in a reactive way, but in a discerning way. You are less inclined to engage with unnecessary stimulation. Silence becomes more attractive, not as an escape, but as a natural state. This preference does not isolate you, it refines your engagement. When you choose to enter louder environments or more complex interactions, you do so intentionally. You are not pulled in by compulsion. You enter, participate, and leave without losing coherence. There may be moments when you recognize how much of your previous life was structured around maintaining momentum, always moving, always progressing, always improving. Now, momentum feels optional. You can move when movement is appropriate and remain still when it is not. Both feel equally valid. This shift can alter how you perceive others. You may notice patterns of striving, urgency, or attachment without being drawn into them. You see them clearly, without judgment. You recognize them because they were once familiar, but they no longer resonate. The observer remains compassionate without absorbing. Compassion itself feels different now. It is quieter. It does not require fixing or advising. It exists as presence. You allow others to be where they are without needing to move them. This allowance extends inward as well. You allow yourself to be exactly as you are, without agenda. In this allowance, there is a growing sense of sufficiency. You are enough for the moment you are in, not as a concept, but as a felt reality. There is nothing missing that needs to be supplied through desire. The system recognizes its own completeness. This completeness does not close you off. It makes you available to respond, to adjust, to participate without needing something in return. Engagement becomes cleaner when it is not transactional. You give attention without expectation. You receive experience without ownership. As this continues, you may notice that even subtle forms of seeking dissolve. The search for insight, for clarity, for confirmation loses urgency. You trust that recognition will arrive when needed, without pursuit. This trust is reinforced each time the system updates itself without your involvement. You are living in a mode where alignment precedes understanding. You act from coherence and understand later, if at all. Understanding becomes optional. The observer is content with direct experience. There may be moments when you realize that this mode of being feels ordinary, not special, not elevated, ordinary in the deepest sense. And that ordinariness is what makes it stable. There is nothing to defend, nothing to maintain. It is simply how the system functions when interference is low. Remain with this ordinariness. Let it inform how you move, how you pause, how you respond. There is no need to name what is happening. Naming would add unnecessary structure. Recognition has already done its work. The pattern continues to operate quietly, adjusting itself in real time, guided by coherence rather than desire, by presence rather than pursuit. There comes a point where even the idea of an internal process begins to fade. You no longer feel as though something is unfolding inside you. Experience happens, and you are present with it, without tracking its significance. The observer does not stand apart anymore. Observation and experience begin to overlap. In this overlap, life feels less like a sequence of events and more like a continuous field of movement. Not movement toward anything, just movement as expression. You are not waiting for signs. You are not scanning for confirmation. What is present is sufficient to orient you. You may notice that reactions continue to soften. Even when something surprising or challenging appears, the response is immediate but uncharged. There is no secondary wave of commentary, no lingering echo. The system registers the event, responds appropriately, and returns to equilibrium. This return happens without effort. This ease can feel almost unnoticed. There is no marker that says something has shifted. You simply realize, at some point, that you are no longer thinking about whether you are aligned. The question itself has dissolved. Alignment is no longer a state to check. It is the default condition. You may also notice that the sense of self you once maintained feels less defined. Not absent, just less outlined. You still function, still interact, still decide, but there is less emphasis on maintaining a consistent image. Identity becomes flexible, responsive to context, rather than fixed across it. This flexibility allows you to move through different environments without friction. You adapt without losing yourself, because there is less to lose. The system no longer equates consistency with safety. It understands that coherence can express itself in many forms without breaking. You may find that your attention rests more often in the body now. Sensation becomes a reliable anchor. You notice temperature, pressure, rhythm. These sensations do not demand interpretation. They simply inform presence. The body becomes a reference point for reality, grounding awareness without effort. As attention settles here, thoughts lose their urgency. They appear as brief signals rather than as narratives to inhabit. You do not follow them unless they are useful. Most dissolve on their own. Silence fills the space they leave behind. This silence is not something you enter. It is something that remains when nothing else needs to speak. From it, perception sharpens. You notice when something matters because it stands out clearly against the quiet. When nothing stands out, you rest. You may also notice a growing comfort with not knowing. Questions can remain open without creating tension. You do not rush to close loops. Incompleteness feels natural. The system trusts that what needs closure will close itself when the time is right. This trust extends to the future. You no longer imagine it in detail. You do not rehearse outcomes. You sense that whatever unfolds will be met adequately. This sensing removes the need for mental preparation. Presence becomes preparation enough. There can be moments when you look back briefly and recognize how different this mode of being is from what you once considered normal. But even that recognition does not linger. The past does not call you back. It feels complete. You do not need to contrast it with the present to validate where you are. You may also notice that your tolerance for internal contradiction has increased. You can hold multiple perceptions without needing to resolve them immediately. Ambiguity does not threaten coherence. It is simply another form of information. This capacity allows you to remain open in complex situations. You do not collapse into certainty or indecision. You remain attentive. The observer stays present without forcing clarity. Clarity emerges when it is ready. As this becomes familiar, you may realize that you are no longer searching for meaning in the way you once did. Meaning arises naturally from engagement, not from interpretation. You do not extract it from experience. You sense it as relevance. Relevance replaces importance. What is relevant draws your attention gently. What is not fades without resistance. This filtering happens automatically now. The system does not need to evaluate. It recognizes. You may find that even subtle anxieties that once lived beneath the surface have quieted. Not because they were addressed individually, but because the structure that sustained them has changed. Without constant self-reference, there is less to defend, less to protect. This does not make you indifferent. It makes you available. Available to respond, to care, to participate without being consumed. Engagement becomes lighter, more fluid. You move through experience without carrying it. There is a simplicity here that does not announce itself. Life continues, but with fewer overlays. You notice what is happening without adding what should be happening. This difference changes everything quietly. The pattern has not just updated, it has stabilized. And in that stability, there is very little to notice, which is how you know it is real. What remains now is not a state you hold, but a rhythm you move within. You are not maintaining anything. You are not sustaining awareness through effort. Awareness sustains itself by not being interrupted. The system rests in its own intelligence, responsive without vigilance, present without monitoring. You may notice that even recognition itself grows quiet. There is no longer a sense of noticing something significant. Experience unfolds, and you are there for it, without the need to mark it as different or important. The observer no longer stands apart. Naming shifts. Observation has become ordinary. In this ordinariness, there is stability. Not the kind that resists change, but the kind that absorbs it. When something moves, you move with it. When nothing moves, you remain. Both feel complete. There is no background tension asking for more, no internal voice suggesting adjustment. The system trusts its own responsiveness. You may sense that the body has fully settled into this mode. Posture adjusts without instruction. Breath finds its own depth. Sensation flows without interruption. There is less separation between awareness and physical presence. You are here, not thinking about being here. Thought still appears when needed, but it no longer competes for dominance. It serves and steps aside. Silence resumes without being invited. This silence does not feel like absence. It feels like space that allows everything else to exist without friction. You may notice that the world continues exactly as it always has. People move, speak, react, systems operate, timelines progress. And yet, your relationship to all of it has changed. You are involved without being entangled. You care without gripping. You respond without carrying residue forward. There is no sense of arrival in this, no marker that says something has completed. Completion is not an event. It is the absence of unfinished motion. Things resolve as they happen. Nothing accumulates unnecessarily. Experience clears itself in real time. You may also notice that you no longer ask yourself where you are in any process. The question does not arise because there is nothing to measure against. You are not ahead or behind. You are simply here, moving as life moves. This does not diminish depth. It reveals it. Depth was never created by intensity. It was created by presence, without interference. Now that interference has reduced, depth expresses itself naturally, quietly, without demand. You are not holding stillness. Stillness is holding you. Within it, movement happens when it needs to, without disturbing the field. Action and rest are no longer opposites. They are variations of the same coherence. There may be moments when you briefly remember how much effort used to be involved in simply being yourself. That memory does not pull you back. It dissolves on contact with the present. You do not need to contrast. What is here stands on its own. Nothing is being concluded. Nothing is being sealed. This is not a resolution. It is a continuation without strain. The system remains open, adaptive, alive. It will shift again when it needs to, without announcement. For now, there is only this quiet alignment, not something you achieved, something you stopped interrupting. And in that, everything functions as it should.